Okay, welcome everyone to the first episode in my landscape post-processing breakdown series. In each episode of the series, I'm going to be taking one shot from my portfolio and breaking down my post-processing workflow from beginning to end through Lightroom and Photoshop. These episodes will be roughly ordered by difficulty, so we'll be starting off with a lot of Milky Way drops before moving on to daytime sky drops and some other more advanced techniques later on. Since this is the first episode, I just want to get some administrative stuff out of the way. So first off, these videos are going to be targeted towards an audience that's already proficient with Lightroom and Photoshop. So it's not going to be a zero to hero kind of series on Photoshop. I'm also not going to be reprocessing any of these shots from scratch. I'm going to be going through the Photoshop file layer by layer and demonstrating a couple of techniques along the way. So the goal here is to hopefully give you some new ideas that you can take and apply to your own work. So I'm not going to be picking apart every single detail of every shot. Just kind of the high level ideas. As far as prerequisites go, you'll first need some kind of pressure sensitive tablet for brushing. I use a Wacom Intuos Pro. This is the small size of the tablet. Some people say that you need a larger tablet for a larger screen, but I edit on a 27-inch monitor and I've never really had any issues with this little guy since I'm usually zoomed in for detail work anyways, right? Next, you should have some version of Tony Kuiper's TK Actions panel installed in Photoshop. I still use V4, so that's what you're gonna see on screen when I hop into Photoshop, but I think he's up to V6 now. You know, it doesn't really matter which version of the panel that you have, the basic ideas are all the same, but like you absolutely need some version of the panel installed because it's just indispensable for working with Luminosity-masks, which like we're gonna be doing a lot in the series. I'll include a link in the description where you can buy the panel and to Tony Kuiper's original series of articles on luminosity masking, which you should absolutely read before you hop into this tutorial if you're going to make any sense out of anything I'm going to be doing, basically. Now that we got all that stuff out of the way, we can move on to the actual tutorial. So we'll just hop right here into Lightroom and get started. So what you're looking at here in Lightroom is all the shots that were used for the final product, which again looks like this. I'll first break down the foreground shots. So I shot these foregrounds during early blue hour at 17 millimeters on my 16-35 mounted to my A7R2. And I shot 2 frames, so 1, 2 for focus stacking. The first thing you're gonna see is how crappy these frames look, right? I mean, the sky is completely blown out on the right side and the histogram here makes it look like I've got absolutely no clue how to operate a camera, right? Well, so there's a reason for that. So I shot this scene with the specific intention of replacing the sky later. I didn't actually care if I blew out those highlights. My priority here was to expose way to the right so that my shadows could remain noise-free. And the reason I shot at blue hour, right, not at sunset or, you know, God forbid midday, is because at blue hour after the sun goes down, you get a lot more diffused light than during the day, which is much more appropriate for a nightscape than like really harsh directional light. Another great thing about shooting at blue hour is that you get this like really great stark difference in exposure between the ground and the sky. And this is gonna make masking out the sky in Photoshop later on a total walk in the park. So I'll reapply my develop settings and explain them a little bit. Generally speaking, I only use this basic panel here in Lightroom for initial raw processing, and I do everything else in Photoshop. So what I did with this shot here was first I updated color temperature, just a little cooler with a little more of a magenta tint. I took the exposure down 2 stops, right? Because I mean, this is supposed to eventually look like it was shot at night after all, right? Once I took the exposure down, then I just went with a pretty basic workflow for these other 4 sliders, right? Highlights down, shadows up, decrease contrast, whites up, blacks down a little bit to expand that histogram a little bit. For the second shot in this focus stack here, so it had actually gotten a little darker by the time I shot this. And so you'll see here, right, the exposure I didn't bring it down quite as much. And I actually think what I did was I first edited this shot here and then duplicated all the settings over to this guy using sync settings down here. And then once that was done, I did, so Lightroom has this thing, it's pretty nifty, called match total exposures, right? And I think that's how I got this weird negative 1.98 exposure value for the first shot. Okay, so the Milky Way file I used was a 23 shot panel that I put together with my A7R2 and a Sigma 85 f1.4 on a tracker. So I shot 2-minute exposures at f2 and ISO 800, working in a serpentine pattern. So I'll just kind of step through these shots here so you can get an idea of how they were put together. working column-wise across the whole Milky Way. Once I was done shooting these files, I just took them into Lightroom and merged them into a raw file, which looks like this. And for this file, I actually took that raw into PixInsight to do most of my initial color correction and stretching. So that final file looks like this. But if you don't have PixInsight, you don't know how to use it, that's totally fine. I'm going to be showing you how to do very similar adjustments just in Photoshop itself. So now we're in Photoshop with the finished file, and I'll go ahead and turn off all the layers except the foreground shots. First things first, you'll notice that I opened the raw files from Lightroom as smart objects in Photoshop. Always take your raws into Photoshop as smart objects so that you can still apply raw adjustments to them halfway through your workflow in Photoshop. If you take a shot into Photoshop, not as a smart object, you do some kind of destructive operation like a free transform or warp, then you decide, oh, I want a different color temperature, or oh, I forgot to apply a lens correction halfway through an edit, you're gonna be really, really sad. So always use smart objects when taking shots into Photoshop from Lightroom. Okay, so now we'll break down the focus stack. So my typical workflow here for focus stack is I will place the foreground file at the bottom with the background file above it, and I will just zoom way into the shot and look for where the foreground file starts to drop off in sharpness, right? In this case, for this shot, it was around here. And then once I find that boundary, I take the lasso tool, which is L on your keyboard, and I just kind of real roughly draw around it, right? So, in this case, it would look something like this, right? I'll apply that as a mask to the background layer, making sure to invert it first, right? Because we want to hide this foreground area from the background shot. Then I'll usually just take a low opacity brush and zoom in and kind of feather it manually and look for any weird artifacts along the boundary, right? So I'll show you guys the actual finished focus stack mask for this shot. As you can see, it's almost all lasso tool, right? Just a little bit of manual feathering here and here. Now we have to prepare the file to create a mask for this whole sky region. To do that, we're going to apply a really strong curves layer just temporarily to this foreground so we can exaggerate the difference in luminosity between the sky and the foreground. And so that's going to be this curves layer that I'll turn on right here. Right, so what we're looking for in a curves layer here is that the ground is is entirely black, and the sky is as close to completely blown out 100% white as possible. And you'll do this by making a kind of like inverted Z with your curves layer. The exact curve that you're going to apply is going to vary greatly depending on the source material that you're working with, right? So don't take a look at this and apply it to every single shot you have. Just play around with it, find the boundary kind of of luminosity between the foreground and background for your specific shot until you get something that looks like this. Now that we've prepared the file for masking, we're going to go into the TK Actions panel here. And I'm going to create all my lights masks just to evaluate which one will be more appropriate. Now that we've created all the light masks, we can just turn off this temporary curves layer so we can see what we're looking at. So when I'm evaluating these masks, what I'm looking for is one that creates a real sharp selection between the sky and the ground, right? So lights 1 here actually looks pretty good. But if I step down to lights 2, I think it actually looks a little better, right? So take a look at lights 1, lights 2, lights 2. The boundary here with the mountains is just a little bit sharper than lights 1. So that's going to be our base mask for the sky. So we've decided on lights 2 as the base mask for our sky. So the next step is to actually place the sky in there, right? So in this example here, I've actually, I've already placed the file in here. It's gone through a heavy series of free transforms since, as a 23 shot pano at 42 megapixels, like, it's an enormous file, right? So basically all I did here was I just shrunk it down, rotated it to make it look kind of like an earlier phase Milky Way core, making sure that, I place Rho Fuji here right in the upper right hand corner of the frame just to balance the composition. I will demonstrate actually real quick how I made this mask, which looks like this when it's fully applied. And so we said lights 2 was going to be our base mask, right? So we select lights 2 and apply that to our sky layer. And now we take a big brush, 100% opacity. Use your mouse for this, not your tablet, because we want, completely 100% white. Oop. And we're just going to go ahead and paint in this much, right? Cool. Now we can zoom into this mask here and see what's going on at the boundary. You see it's a little rough, right? We have some it's almost like chromatic aberration from the selection. That's okay. We can actually get rid of this pretty easily. So we will reselect this mask that we just created. I'm gonna now delete it from the layer. I'm gonna go to Select, Modify, Expand. I'm just gonna expand the selection by 2 pixels. It seems appropriate. And then I'm just gonna reapply the selection. And see, so immediately you can see here, it's a lot better, right? You don't have that harsh kind of like chromatic aberration at the edge. So we're almost done with this sky mask. Just 2 little things that we need to fix. You can see this peak here and this peak here stick out from the rest of the landscape just because they're like so much brighter than the rest of these mountains in the background, right? So we're just gonna manually mask these out with our brush tool and tablet. I'm gonna switch to my brush tool. I'm going to pick the soft brown pressure opacity brush at 100% opacity. This brush is going to change opacity depending on how hard I'm pressing into my Wacom tablet, right? I'm going to zoom way in here, pick a real small brush, and I'm going to pick the white color because I want to show this guy here. I'm just going to manually brush this guy out, right? Just like that. Cool. And I'll do the same thing for the peak here on this side. And then before we can call it a day on this mask, I'm just gonna go ahead and alt click this mask just to see exactly what I've got selected. And it looks good enough, but we just to clean it up, I'm just gonna switch to black and completely paint out this foreground just so we don't get any like random stars in the middle of it too. Cool. And that's pretty much all we have to do for masking. Okay, so now that we have our final sky mask, you'll notice that this Milky Way looks kind of out of place in this foreground, right? It's pretty greenish, like green and yellow are the dominant colors here, whereas here in the foreground, there's mainly a lot of blue and some yellow here on the dunes, right? So it kind of clashes with the foreground. My next step here was just to apply a color balance layer to basically even out the color palette between the sky and the foreground. So I've clipped this color balance layers only to the Milky Way. In the midtones, I've really boosted the blues, just tweaked towards magenta and cyan a little bit. Shadows, tweaked those a bit towards magenta, and no adjustment to the highlights. And that already looks, if we toggle this, a lot better than the original file just straight from Photoshop. It's this step here that if you're working with a raw file for your Milky Way instead of an already processed file from PixInsight as I am, this is where you do your initial stretching. So I'll demonstrate that with this file. Even though it's already stretched, I can stretch a little further and just kind of demonstrate the techniques. So I like to do my first stretch with a levels layer. So I'll add a levels adjustment layer clipped to the sky. And what we're looking for here is just to drag this left side of the levels just to clip off a little bit of the blacks and then stretch and then take this right side and do the same, clip off just a little bit of the highlights, right? Cool. So that's the initial stretch. Next, I usually take a curves layer here. Again, clipped to just the sky. Here you can see that we've kind of like nicely filled out the histogram a little bit more, right? And so now we're just going to apply like a very basic S-curve for contrast. I like to taper off here just at the end of the highlights, so I'm not blowing the bright stars away. Tweak this to your taste. In this case, I think if I were to really stretch this, it looks something like this. So that's pretty much how I would stretch this file from scratch. But in this case, I didn't actually go with such a contrasty Milky Way, right? Just because the foreground here was not that contrasty, I thought a slightly more washed out Milky Way would be a little more appropriate for the scene. Again, it's going to depend on what your foreground looks like. In this case, I just decided that I didn't want to stretch it anymore. The next thing we're going to do here is grade the foreground to look a little more like it was shot at night, right? Right now it's way too bright. It's still a little contrasty. So we'll do that with a unmasked curves layer, and that looks like this. And so I'll show you this curves. It's pretty basic. I just place 2 points on the curve, drag them both down a little bit, just to basically darken the whole image, right? And so you can already see like it's looking a lot more like a nighttime kind of shot. So next, I thought that the shot in the foreground was still a little too contrasty. The highlights are just a little too bright for something that's supposed to be shot like in the dead of night, right? So we want a curves layer that's going to target the brighter highlights. So I'm going to, again, start off by just creating all my lights masks here. Now that we have all our lights masks, I'm just going to flip through them one by one, look for something that targets the brightest areas of the foreground. Lights 1 clearly targets way too much. Light 2 looks pretty good. And if we flip to lights 3, I mean, it's clear that it's entirely inappropriate, right? Nothing in the foreground selected. So lights 2 is our mask for the upcoming curves layers. Those curves layers, when applied, they look like this. So they just decrease the brightness of the brightest areas of the foreground. If we click into the first one here, it's just a really, really strong curve, downward curve, to decrease the brightness of the areas that were masked out by this lights 2 mask. And then basically the exact same thing applied once more over the same mask, just to bring down that brightness a little bit more, right? So now this foreground looks a lot more appropriate for something that's, supposedly shot during the night. The last adjustment before we can consider the blending portion of this shot to be done is just a little increase in saturation for the Milky Way, right? So here's the adjustments, a little bit up on the master, and then just a ton on reds and yellows to bring out the nice detail here in the core without making this, the rest of this background sky way too blue. So that's that, right? That's the end of the blending portion of this tutorial. Moving on, we're just going to go ahead and do some contrast adjustments, some dodge burn, and then finally we're going to add some light bleed to kind of play off this, this side lit foreground. For contrast, I like to apply my curves layers for contrast over luminosity masks. So the finished ones look like this. I'll toggle them a couple of times so you can see the effect. How I always start off is that I first create all my lights masks. Once I have all the lights masks, I look for one that's, moderately lenient. In this case, lights 2 is way too strict, so I just did lights 1. And I just click this button here to create a curves layer already masked with lights 1. So that curves layer is actually right here. I'll show you the S-curve that I dragged out with it. It's a pretty basic S-curve that if you've used Photoshop or Lightroom before, you've probably made an S-curve a lot like this. I will go ahead and turn just this on. So this will just bring down the brightness of most of the highlights a little bit and introduce essentially some local contrast within these highlights. Now we're finished with contrast for our highlights. We're going to do the exact same thing for our darks, right? So we're going to go into the TK Actions panel. I'm going to make all my dark masks. And once again, I'm going to flip through the dark masks until I find something that's moderately selective. Darks 1, Darks 2, clearly way too selective. But Darks 3 looks pretty good. And Darks 4 is just a little too strict for what I want, right? So we use Darks 3 as the mask for the contrast curve for the shadows. And that looks like this. Again, big S curve for contrast. Again, this is a night shot, so mainly just decreasing the brightness of these shadows to make it look darker. And then dragging the curve up here at the end to increase some contrast within the darker tones. The next step after adjusting the contrast is manual dodging and burning, right? So dodging and burning just means brushing in shadows or light to bring out, for example, like leading lines in your image or to paint in a vignette. It's a way for you as an artist to direct the viewer's eyes. So I'll first show you what the dodge burn layers look like for this shot. So first we have a burn layer. So this is a soft light layer filled in with 50% gray. You can get this by holding Alt and new layer. When you select soft light, there's an option here, right? Fill with soft light neutral color. So here is what this layer looks like by itself. So what you can see I've done here is I've painted in a really strong vignette here at the bottom. And I've also vignetted the image a little bit at the top, right? So how I've done this is that I take my brush tool and I usually lower it to about 15% opacity. And I take a completely black brush and using my Wacom tablet and pretty light pressure on the pen, I just kind of manually paint in a vignette until, you know, I get something that looks a little more pleasing, right? Generally speaking, I almost always start with a vignette on an image. I find that painting in the vignette helps actually focus me to like the parts of the image that are more important. I mean, I think this is the one step in my workflow that I always do, right? The vignette amount and strength may vary between shots, but it's always like the very first thing I brush in. So the other burn work that I did was first to strengthen the shadows along the backside of these dunes. And so you can see that here in the burn layer. I also went into the Milky Way, zoomed way in with a small brush and accented these darker dust lanes, right? So if I flip on this burn layer again, and just kind of accenting these darker dust lanes and bringing out basically a little more contrast in the Milky Way manually. So if you take a look at just the sky as I flip this layer on and off, right? Just kind of adds a little extra pop to the core. So next up is the dodge layer. The dodge layer is an overlay layer instead of a soft light. You can also use soft light for your dodging. I just like the way that overlay looks. I think it helps focus the adjustments a little more to the brighter parts of the image. So how I do my dodge layers is a lot similar to how I do my burn layers. I use a soft brush, 15% opacity I find is a good place to start. And I just manually highlight parts of the image that I feel like highlighting. Some people will paint their dodge burn over luminosity masks or like a specific selection. Like 90% of the time, I'd say that I just do it freehand. And so if I just show you here what's going on in this dodge layer, right? Just the 3 little leading lines here through the foreground of the dune that I've highlighted, and then row of Fuji up here in the upper right. We're almost done with the processing for the shot at this point. Actually, it looks pretty decent right now, right? There's just one little detail that bothers me, might not bother you. It's these dunes here, right? They're still pretty strongly side lit. So it's kind of hard to, to play that off like, oh, I shot this in the middle of the night with this, beautiful contrasty Milky Way core. But there's still this like soft side light on the dunes. So to play this off, what I did was I added some fake glow from the right side of the frame to mimic sort of like moon glow. So I'll turn on this group of layers here real quick. Right, so now we have some like light leaking in from the right side of the frame so that the light on the right side of these dunes isn't so suspicious anymore. Creating these light leak layers is actually super simple to do. I can probably show this to you live. If my computer can handle it, of course. So first, I'm going to create a new soft light layer, just like I did with burn. I'm going to fill it with soft light neutral color, 50% gray. You notice that this has absolutely no effect, right? And that's exactly the way it should be. So I'm going to select 2 colors. The first one is 50% gray. And that's the hex code for that is 7F, 7F, 7F. And a second color, I'm just going to pick something, yellowish and bright. I think this is a pretty good hue. I'm just going to drag the cursor a little bit over. Yeah, this is pretty good. Now that I have my 2 colors selected, I'm going to open my gradient tool, G on your keyboard. I'm going to select a circular gradient. I'm going to start first where I'd imagine like the light source would be, right? In this case, it's off the frame. So imagine, you know, this, like we had a moon right here, for example, right? That was casting this light. I mean, technically it'd probably be like all the way over here. But then our gradient's gonna be way too weak. I'll take this gradient tool and holding shift on my keyboard so that I'm limited to only going 45 degrees or 90 degrees. I'm just gonna drag this circular gradient over somewhere into the middle of the frame, right? Cool. That's actually not too bad for the first go. Next, I'm going to duplicate this layer by hitting Command J. And I'm going to draw another gradient, but decrease the radius a little bit, right? So I'm not going to go quite as far into the frame. And I'm going to repeat this process maybe 4 to 5 times, decreasing the radius of the gradient a little bit each time. And so this will mimic the natural light fall off from a light source. And we'll just try one last one over here. Cool. These will be our light leak layers. Right now you can see the effect is it's a little strong, right? There are 2 ways to get around this. One is you can just kind of manually reduce the opacity. So like, you know, in this case, 25% is a little weak. We'll go to like 40%, right? And that's like, that's good enough, you know? Another way is to, so first bring the opacity all the way up to 100%. So if you think about how a light leak would work, right? Clearly it's gonna hit the sky. You know, if you imagine there's any kind of like haze in the sky, right? It's gonna light up the sky, but it's only gonna light up the foreground in the areas that are already lit up, right? So we wouldn't want to like completely blow out some of these like the shadows here from the footprints, or you know, we wouldn't want it leaking over here to the backside of the dune, right? To mask this light leak layer, we can either paint manually, which, you know, for this image, I actually did, or we can use luminosity masking again. So to construct the mask for our light leak layer, I'm going to first turn the light leak off, and I'm going to construct yet again all the lights masks for this image. And again, I'm looking for one that's, you know, moderately selective. In this case, lights 1 is about as good as we're going to get. I think lights 2 is going to be result in way too weak of an effect. Okay, but if we just select the lights 1 mask and apply it to this light leak layer, actually we can do that right now and see what it looks like, right? So I'll apply it here. Well, it looks really weird in the sky, right? Because we're only masking the light leak onto the bright areas in the Milky Way. That's not really how it would work in real life. And I mean, even if it was how it worked in real life, I actually don't think it looks that great compared to even to like no mask at all, for example. So we want to use this lights 1 mask for the foreground, but keep the light bleed all on the sky layer here, right? And it's actually pretty easy to do. So let me delete this layer mask real quick. We're going to go into our initial blend and reselect the mask that we created just for the sky. And then holding Shift and Command, I'm going to click on this lights 1 channel here, which will add that selection to this sky only selection. So now we have a mask that masks all of the sky completely white, and then selects only the brightest 50% of the foreground. So if we now apply that to our light leak layer, we can take a look at it. It's exactly what we want, right? Now, if we turn this light leak layer back on, nice, right? We have a nice glowy effect in the sky, and we've accented these the highlights in the foreground with a little more light from our basically fake moon. So if I were to process this shot again from scratch, this is probably how I would do the light leak. In this case, though, what I did with this light leak was I decreased the effect to about 25% opacity, although I had a ton of gradient layers here. And I manually masked it using my tablet and brush out of the shadowed areas of the foreground. We're almost done now. Just one tiny little detail to fix before we can wrap up this edit. If you look at the mountains in the background here, they don't really form a straight line with the horizon, right? That's just kind of like how the landscape was when I shot it, but it makes this shot look all kinds of like tilted. So we're just gonna fix that real quick. And how I normally would do this is that I would save this file as a PSB, a large document format Photoshop file. And then I would reopen it as a smart object in Photoshop. But for demonstration purposes here, I'm actually just gonna stamp all my layers into a single layer and show you how I fix this line. We've got all the layers stamped into one now. If you're working in a real workflow, this would be a new Photoshop file with our original edit opened up in just a single layer as a smart object. So now that I have this, I'm gonna free transform it by hitting Command T. I'm gonna click on this little icon here, which takes me into the warp mode for free transform. And now I'm basically just gonna real subtly warp these mountains down until they look a little flatter. And that looks pretty good. Before you apply the transformation, just do your due diligence, zoom way in here to the edges and the corners, make sure that you haven't accidentally created any transparent pixels. And once that's good to go, apply the transformation and you're all done. And just as a little comparison of what that tiny little warp did, we can turn this top layer off and back on again. And I think it's actually a pretty big difference in the final product. Okay, and that pretty much wraps up this post-processing breakdown. Hope you found it helpful, found some new techniques that you can use in your work. And I'll be back in a week or two with another Milky Way drop.